Okay, if you can let me know if the slide's showing up.
It is.
Very good. I've got 12 noon on my clock. Like to welcome everyone to the monthly dairy webinar series hosted by the Iowa State University Extension Dairy Team. My name is Fred Hall, and I'm the Iowa State Extension Dairy Field Specialist in Northwest Iowa. Today's topic is farm stress and will be presented by Larry Tranel. A few housekeeping issues before we start. Please mute your microphone and turn off your camera. We'll open it up for questions at the end. If you want to type a question during the presentation, you can add it to the chat box. And finally, after the program, please take the short survey. You can access that by clicking on it there at the top of the chat column. There also includes a link to material that Larry has put together. Dr. Tranel grew up on a Wisconsin dairy farm, majored in ag economics and international studies with masters in ag industries, all from UW-Platteville. Dr. Tranel spent 10 years as a dairy farm management agent with UW Extension and the past 20 years with Iowa State Extension as a dairy specialist. Larry's doctorate in pastoral physiology and experience working with farmers give him a unique insight in working with producers. Dr. Tranel, welcome to the monthly webinar series.
Appreciate that, Fred, and thanks for having me.
You go ahead and you'll be able to share your screen now.
All right, so appreciate that. So let me just try to get this to go. Okay, so basically what we're going to do is talk about some farm stress, but a lot of behavioral health type issues that come along with farmers. And so one of the first things we take a look at as we're dealing with farmers, and whether it be dairy farmers or whatever, is that we always have our farm happiness index, what I tend to say. We wake up in the morning, and if it's sunny out, we have this weather index, or if the milk price is up or down, okay, kind of really plays on our emotions, whether it's going to be a better day or not so good day. And so I think the important thing is we go through a lot of perceptions that happen like this, but the important things is that simple things in our life, whether it be the weather or the prices, can really impact our psyche for the day, our happiness index. And the other important part of that is that happiness index can actually affect others that we work with in this process called transference. And so it's pretty simple to realize, when we're in a room and everybody's kind of having a fun old time, and somebody comes into that room that's not having the best of times, or maybe a little down, a little depressed, how it can affect the mood of the whole room. And so when we take a look at working with our emotions, it's important for us to realize ours and how we can transfer those emotions, whether it be positively or negatively, with that. So when we take a look at, people have a cloudy day or negative emotions, I always try to help them realize that, that sun is shining just the way it was, whether it's cloudy or not. Okay, but it's our perception because of the clouds and negative emotions, and sometimes we can't see the beautiful sunshine. So here's a human function curve that a colleague had shared with me that I think tells kind of a story, is that people talk about stress as being such a thing as being bad. Okay, and yes, it is bad when it gets to the point on the right side here where we start seeing a lot of fatigue or exhaustion, or even gets into a trauma. And so we have the distress, but there's also good stress. Okay, so anytime we feel tension actually helps us, kind of stretch and things like that. It's actually an act of growth when our tension is actually can be healthy, and there's actually the increases of performance, and we get aroused by different things that we like to do. It kind of cause stress, trying to get so many things done, but there's also a growth phase with that. But it's to the point where stress gets into the straining side of things, where we get too much that causes the breakdown and the too much strain, and whether it be acute or different types of stress that we actually work with. When we take a look at the bottom line with this slide is that some stress is actually good. We realize that too much isn't, but let's not look at stress as being a bad thing. When we take a look at the farm market reality, we realize that there's a lot of stress out there just in the farm markets. Okay, so when we take a look at all the market forces and whether they be economic, political, cultural, other situations that affect milk prices or other types of commodity prices, sometimes we just have farmers that just, trying to make the best they can decisions, they trying to make the best decisions they can with so much information. It can be so overwhelming and we can actually put ourselves under a lot of stress. But the reality of it is none of us are ever going to completely understand these markets. We can try to guess as best we can, but the reality of that future is uncertain. So let's not get us too stressed out just trying to figure out what that reality is going to be. So we have market stress, when prices are high or low, whatever we're taking a look at, we got negative margins and negative cash flow. But I think sometimes a phase that we don't often realize is that we can get ourselves into a stage of market grief. And the dairy industry has undoubtedly had some market grief over different times or different time periods. You think back in 2009, that was definitely a stage, not just of market stress, that was market grief, where we got milk prices that started hovering in that $10 range. So we have these different types of time frame. And so the bottom line is on the right side, I take a look at, holy cow, what do you do now when we try to gauge it? So again, with farmers, is it stress? What's the reality of it? Or is it really getting into a phase of grief? And that's when we really need to be concerned in working with farmers in regards to it. So gauging reality, the stress, and if experiencing the grief is a big tip there. So when we take a look at my page, there we go. Okay, so farm market reality is when people get into some very difficult types of stress on the farm. Okay, they report feelings of being overwhelmed. Sometimes they'll get depressed. They become immobilized, a lack of energy, and there's different parts of the brain that kind of cause this because they're kind of in a fight or flight type mode. Loss of hope, energy, anxiety, anger, tears, and sometimes just the ability. And the important thing for us is that their ability to make good decisions is actually somewhat deterred because of all this stress, because they can't get their mindset into the prefrontal cortex of their brain where the good things happen, where our thought processes happen. They're kind of stuck in the more emotional type thing in the back end of it, which is kind of the old human brain that was there before we actually had a lot of critical thinking skills given to us. And so when we take a look at that, confusion, emotions are running high, but the thought process just tends not to be there quite as well. And so one of the things I tend to say as a tip on this slide is just, how do you kind of take a look at that thought process of the George Strait song about write this down? Because a lot of times we can mention to these producers or we as farmers ourselves and just, people are talking about this. It's hard for us to process a lot, but the fact that we can write this down, I think is an important piece. In fact, I'll go back to the example of some of our farm couple getaways where we have these comments sometimes for farmers. It wasn't until the fact that you made us write this down that we actually got anywhere on this goal. And so I think that's a very important piece when farmers are under stress is that we help them write these things down so that they can make the best decisions they can. We realize that a lot of farms, sometimes we get to the point where we're going to start losing something. We may actually have to leave the farm, but we need some types of exit plans there because we realize that as things go south in some respects, that the easiest route is to do nothing and just hope things resolve themselves. And that's probably one of the least good ways of actually trying to work with resiliency, because just trying to hope things are going to work out without actually having a plan, it's pretty difficult to really assist situations. So we realize, what's the after part of this, when cows might leave the farm, people might have to leave the farm, or even just a different way of farming and things like that. We become so attached to what we're doing on the farm. There's so many emotions tied to that it's tough for us to think about a different way of doing things, and change doesn't come easy as we get a little bit older. So the bottom line is undoubtedly to plan, set goals rather than just to hope things are going to resolve themselves out. That word hope is actually a very important piece of it, because as we start taking a look at anybody in whatever areas of life, farming or whatever, we start losing hope, we realize that we're starting to get into a downward spiral of things not going so well. But we need to look at other options, realizing what that new reality would be, and just hopefully have a new acceptance that gives hope for a meaningful life in the future. And it might be different than before, but the bottom line is to encourage, whether it be ourselves as dairy farmers or other types of farmers, or whoever, but just to try to give hope. So a lot of times we're faced with situations, we got a bridge to cross, a river to cross, or whatever, how we're going to do this. Some people are going to take the bridge, some people might take a boat. But the bottom line is, anytime we're faced with an obstacle in our lives, there's a lot of chaos created in anybody's life. But as we are faced with this chaos and these obstacles, what are we going to do? And bottom line is that some people are going to think of this as a problem. Some people are going to look at this as a challenge, and other people are going to actually look at this as an opportunity that I can get somewhere or move off on center to work within. So it's kind of a three different mindsets, kind of a part of our personalities that actually play into this as well. But again, the situation is how we're going to deal with it. So how do we help ourselves focus beyond the problem to deal with this challenge, or maybe even look at some opportunities that might come because of it? So I like this quote here, that the problem in life is not that there's problems. The problem is expecting life without problems, thinking that having a problem is a problem. And that so often becomes the problem, because we realize that in dealing with problems, it transforms us, it builds us into becoming more than before. In fact, problems themselves can often ignite some more wholeness within us, some growth within us, which is why I tend to say having a problem isn't always a problem. When we take a look at, again, the tip here is to help us focus beyond the problem to that opportunity, to that challenge. When we look at farm stress, and there's just in the last couple of years, I mean, just so much more information out there on farm stress, so many more people trying to deal with it, because we realize, and this isn't just a new phenomenon over the last 10, 15, 20, 30 years, I'm sure this has always been with us, is that there's been a lot of farm stress out there. And I think we're just starting to kind of recognize the problem. How do we become more resilient? How do we recognize the face of farm stress? Because a lot of times we can look at each other, look at our producers, or look at ourselves in the mirror, and sometimes we can't really figure out just by looking at the face if this person's under stress. Sometimes they will give us some signs. So whether it be the farmers themselves, or sometimes the farm spouses, and sometimes that farm spouse might be male, might be female. But a lot of times, one of the things we take a look at is how the kids are being affected by this, but also those farm spouses. Because, and now I'm just going to mention a little bit about some of the farm women that are pictured in here. Can you tell if they're under stress or not? Okay, they may be thinking, they may be doing some other things, of actually having some positive thoughts or just discussing things, but they tend to carry a heavy load as well, not just dealing with maybe their male counterpart, their husband as a farmer, but dealing with how the kids are dealing with it, maybe dealing with homeschooling with all the COVID issues, working outside the home, yet a lot of the expectations. So I think there's a lot of farm stress here with women that we sometimes don't give proper attention to, so to speak. So the bottom line, a lot of faces of farm stress and their resiliency to deal with it tend to vary. So if I would just have one slide about talking about farm stress and how to try to deal with it and help ourselves be more resilient, I would just basically put this slide up: think like a proton, be positive, because research project after research project just shows that those that think more positively, again, is it a problem or is it a challenge or an opportunity? How do we think positively about our issues in life? So now we have, we had a lot of farm stress, and then we put COVID-19, and I see I misspelled the COVID part of it, but it changes our social interaction. Okay, so we can have some people that are still very happy about what things are going on their farms. We get a lot of people that are getting pretty defensive about not just prices, but how things are being active, politically, socially, culturally, within our society right now. But we add layers of stress and stress on top of each other, and it kind of compounds the issue. And we also think of, just with the COVID, about, it's not just the defensively, but we start talking to people, and it's hard for me. Sometimes I'm smiling at somebody and they don't even realize it. They might think I'm frowning just with my eyes or whatever, because they can't see my face. And so what's that emotion behind the mask? But it really challenges our ability to relate to people when we've got the mask on all the time. So even with COVID, what's behind the mask? Okay, so when we take a look at stress, and when we take a look at it as it goes too far to its distress, to the point that it actually comes into trauma, that's when we really need to have community support, people to talk to, resources to deal with, because with loss of hopelessness tends to get pretty first and foremost in people's mind. So picture number one, we look at anytime things like this happen, there is no turning back. This storm happened, we can't change it, so we can't turn back on it, but we also can't turn our back to it, which I think is an important piece, because some people just want to turn their back on problems, and it's just really important for us to turn forward, look up, and face it. So number two, with this picture about just how do you assess the damage relatively. So anytime we see something that's traumatizing in life, I don't have to look too far to other people's lives that have, and I do this with my kids all the time when they start complaining about this, that, or the other thing. Just the whole thought process about, think about some of the places you've been in the world and how relatively happy they are and how little they truly have in the way of material possessions. But again, what truly makes us happy in this life. So assess the damage, but do that relatively. Number three is to look up and despite. So whatever happens in us, how do we try to just, keep our chest up, keep our head up or whatever, just to look positively and with the confidence thought process that we can deal with this. Number four is how do we identify and deal with feelings, because it's pretty easy to have a lot of feelings of desperation. And again, when we start losing hope in the future, that's when we start to get extremely concerned with what's going on. And then number five, again, with these COVID issues and these protective issues, again, has just put another layer on top of any other stress that we tend to find that we feel. So look forward, assess the damage, do that relatively, do not lose hope, and try to identify those emotions and those feelings that we're working with, and help your family members as well to deal with them. So when we take a look at farm stress resiliency, we just again realize that stress is normal, it can be healthy. Okay, but it's when we get too much acute stress or piled up stress or chronic stress, it just continues to happen over time. It just can really get into the thought process of the brain. And so if we can't get that from the emotions in the back part of the brain to the prefrontal cortex, it just makes things very difficult for us to concentrate and remember to process the information, because that's the part of the brain that needs to do that. And if we're stuck in the emotion part in the back, it's very difficult. So to sleep, to relax, to breathe properly. So it can really dampen our spirit, our appetite, our physical stamina, or just our focus in our relationships. But it's important moving the farm forward, our decision-making ability, which really is of a big concern when people are under too much stress. So the bottom line that there are some life skill and some mindset tactics that assist us to deal with the farm stress. So I tried to put together a little kind of an acronym on farm stress resiliency that's basically a primer. So the perception is our thoughts under stress, just reality. Everybody deals with a different reality. Again, identifying our emotions, our managing our reactions, those mindset tactics, extending ourselves, which are communication and our support, and different types of resources that we have to try to deal with the stress. So when we're working with somebody, I always say, remember three, or acronym D. Okay, so people can tend to remember three things. Okay, you start putting a fourth or fifth or sixth goal in that, again, please write it down, or try to put some kind of an acronym together that they can try to help remember it by. So we realize there's a lot of tough times on farms, and sometimes it's those tough times that actually help families grow together, but they can also kind of help them or make them grow apart at some point in time. But I think one of the things that we realize in our lives in these last 15 years is that there are smaller amounts of margin in our lives. Okay, whether it be because of time, because of finances, just being overwhelmed with busyness, so that there's a new norm. And so when we start taking a look at our lives, they being pulled apart in a lot of different directions, which can definitely cause some stress and even more stress that we have. And if we take a look at social media, the way that can cause a lot of stress, because we're always dealing with people's emotions, news agencies that are just really playing on our emotions. And so again, that keeps us on the back part of the brain. Sometimes we can't think it quite as clearly, or we get those emotions stirred. It's tough to move on to the next stage of it. So how do we make that mindfulness that's made in the margin and try to work with the present part of our lives versus the future and the concerns of what's happening here and there? So we realize that too much stress, again, can cause a lot of things, and chronic stress can really shorten brain receptors, the nerve endings. So we have this concept that we can actually fry our brains, that it literally can be true because of those nerve endings that can be shortened. Okay, so how do we develop skills that can help us be more resilient to this? I like to mention that the brain is about 3 pounds to us, but it uses about 25% of our energy. John Schuchke said that. University of Wisconsin. So when we're under stress, I just kind of question how much of our energy can it take? Can it take 35, 40, 50% of our energy that goes into our bodies just because our mind's got to process, and it's not an easy thing to do. So chronic stress undoubtedly needs more care. Okay, so that long-term stress is one of the biggest issues that we have, and we've got a lot of farmers that have gone through a lot of long-term stress. Okay, so the P stands for the perception in the acronym, and just as heavily related to that picture that we have in our mind, that thought process, because we realize that the same thing can happen to two different people, and it's just that thought process from one versus the other is really going to change. And so sometimes I wonder what situations that happen to my kids or other people's children, just what kind of a thought and what kind of a picture do they have in mind based on what they have. And so again, the bottom line with our thought process is how do we create positive pictures in both our minds and other people's minds that we're trying to work with. This slide is kind of the tip of the iceberg from the famous psychologist Carl Jung. When you take, until you make the conscious, it'll control your life and you'll just call it fate. But how do we get control of whatever stresses we have with that? John Schutzke would tell a story about this experiment that deals with some mice. And so the first mice in the experiment just lived a normal mouse life, even after the bell would sound and they would get an electrical shock, but the first set would not get the shock. The second set would actually hear the electric or the bell, and they would actually get a shock maybe 8 out of 10 times. But the third set of mice would hear the bell and they get shocked 100% of the time. So the first set kind of lived a normal mouse life. The third set, or the second set that got the shock 8 to 10 out of times, actually didn't fare too much different than the first set. But the third set that got the shock all the time and didn't have any hope, no control over what's happening whatsoever. And I guess they had to push some kind of a button before they would get the shock or not get the shock or whatever. But it's that last set that did not fare so well whatsoever. Most of them did not live very long. But the important part, I think, is that second set, that those that still had some control, even though it wasn't very much control whatsoever, still didn't fare that much different. So it's how much resiliency and that loss of control, I think, is an important piece of the whole picture. So know what we can focus or know and focus on what can be controlled and what can't be. So the primer is that when we a lot of times we can just kind of play mindset games, and sometimes we call it kind of hijacking our emotions, is that we can reinterpret initial negative emotions into more positive meanings, or before we actually experience that negative emotion, how do we get in there and hijack our emotions and actually put a positive meaning to that negative thing that just happened to us. We tend to deal better with it. So again, the problem is not that there's problems or stress. The problem is expecting otherwise and thinking again that having a problem might be a problem. So again, trying to reinterpret negative to positive for better outcomes, better control, and better adaptations of the stress that we have in our lives. So when we take a look at seeing stress as a normal tool, as I mentioned that graph beforehand, but I think another thing that people really realize, and I see this from author after author, you see this in their religions that are around the world, that life is difficult. Okay, it's actually the first premise of the Compassionate Buddha. Okay, so there's other religions, our Christian religion teaches it the same thing, but it's in that process of overcoming that difficulty that often gives life its meaning, because again, it helps us to grow. So that's kind of an attitude, a mindset tactic that we can use to use more positive perception of stressful situations. So stress and difficulty undoubtedly can promote growth and learning. So I threw together just a couple of mindset tactics that I just real briefly tried to think about. So our loss can turn to cross. Okay, so how do we resurrect different things that happen in our lives to a newer life? Pain can turn to gain. How do we move onward and upward? Stress can turn to best. It helps motivate us. Grieve to believe, in love of what was lost. Okay, so other mindset tactics that I work with a few people on is just I ask them just have a phrase of the week. So what is it? So the one that I'm trying to do this week is smile. Okay, smile to be happy. Or what's the word of the year? Okay, so I've got people that are working on words of the year, which I think are important as well. So how can I just spend my year that every time something happens to me, I'm just going to make sure that I take a deep breath and just soak it in and try to think positively about it or smile about it. So mindset tactics aim to give inspiration and also memory recall, but to better our lives. So this is a slide that we're not going to take much time to do it, but I just want to think about the physical, the mental, and the emotional aspects of our lives, and how stressed are we in each and every one of them. So if we're doing well, we're going to be eating and exercising well, feeling healthy, focused, creative, good concentration, propensity to smile, excited, motivate, very proactive in doing things. Okay, so if you're in that phase, we're doing quite well. But it only takes one or two of these to kind of get out of into the, say, the 2 phase. And if you're getting into the 3 phase, you start getting concerned about different types of things. So it's just kind of a scale for us to get about how stressed we are. And once we start getting into that 7 to 9, I say get help. And if somebody that we are working with and you feel they're 9 or greater, okay, it's not just that they need help, it's that you need to get them help, okay, because they just process wise, it's difficult for them to do that themselves. Okay, so we realize that resilient people to stress, they tend to be more proactive, less reactive and passive. Again, they plan to do this, they want to get this done. Okay, so they just don't lose that sense of hope for the future. They continue to plan, set goals for themselves, and try to work with things before they get too influenced by the environment and let other people get them down, let their situations get them down, or just wait for things to happen or to get better on their own. So resilient people do something about their situations. So the R stands for reality, and just in the interest of time, we all live in a different reality. There's a hierarchy of life, and we're all in positions. So how do we bloom where we're planted? Okay, so there's always going to be somebody better at you than this, or in a better situation. And if we spend our lives worrying about other people's situations and their relative success or relative failures, it doesn't do a lot for us to realize that we need to understand where we are in life and how we can make the most of it in the situation that is played towards us. So we all have a different reality in our needs and our wants. So the reality is that we also have this kind of a psychological mindset that we always want to keep up to the Joneses. You know, the grass is greener on the other side of the fence. So the thought of getting a new this or a better milk price, a better something. Okay, what we tend to find is that once we get it, it was more so the thought of getting it that gave us more happiness. But in reality, once we have it, we find out, well, that really wasn't so. And if we don't get it, especially for young kids, they often play the blame game that life isn't fair. We should have gotten in, and we spend our whole lives, you know, just with the stress of thinking, you know, if only would have done this, or only if I would have done that, how much better my life. So you can just understand the stress of a situation like that. But it's a simple mindset type thing that people fall prey to, I think, way too often. So the Joneses might be less happy than you, even though they might have all this stuff, they might be less happy. So the I is for identifying emotions. And when we take a look at it in the counseling phase, you know, it's easy to sort out the facts about this happened and that happened, but it's not so easy to sort out the emotions of all this because they're so intertangled. It might happen, you know, we've got this emotion that happened because of something that happened 3 years ago, which is tied to something that happened 5 years ago, which might actually be tied to something that happened in our childhood. And so sometimes we feel these emotions, and we don't understand the pathway of how they got into our head or how we're going to try to deal with it. But one of the emotions, you know, sometimes, you know, people get anger, a little volatile about different types of things, or they react in a kind of a harsh way, to realize that that tends to be a secondary emotion, okay, which is often expressed due to some kind of a primary emotion. And one of the primary emotions that I tend to say on the negative side is we feel this disgust. So somebody does something, somebody says something to us, and we kind of feel a little bit of a disgust, which might lead to some kind of resentment or a negative attitude towards this person or whatever. So when we take a look at anxiety, depression, so those are often have some kind of a root cause that we need to kind of work with. So I think it's important for us to look inward and try to identify those causes, and even as much so as not transfer those negative emotions back to ourselves or to somebody else. Okay, so even though a negative thing happened, and just because my spouse was in the near area, I might actually attach this negative emotion to her, even though she had nothing to do with it and was not even involved with the situation, but just because of her nearness, first person I saw after something like that happened, you know, emotions can get attached different places, even though they weren't the source. So identify these emotions and do not transfer is a simple mindset tactic for us to work with. When we take a look at different kinds of pain and things that happen in our lives, they definitely need different types of attention as well. Okay, so when we have feelings of guilt, grief, anxiety, failure, loneliness, you know, just because we feel this, we might try to do something else to work with it. So if you feel like a failure, how do you really focus on your strengths? Because so many people, when they fail at something, they focus so much on the negative thing, with the failure itself, versus, how do I try to overcome this, or focus on my strengths and try to reaffirm my resiliency to get over this. So no pain, no gain, work ourselves through that. So positive emotions, when we start taking a look at every time something happens in our brain, okay, it tends to trigger a chemical reaction. Okay, so again, here's where we talk about hijacking our emotions, because we tend to pretty quickly identify that emotion or experience something, and that's going to send body signal. Do we send cortisol? Do we send adrenaline? What are we going to send into our brains to do that? But we kind of label all this experience as good, bad, happy, sad, whatever. So it's undoubtedly a mind over matter deal. And I think the important thing is that positive thoughts tend to be precursors to positive feelings. And it's those feelings that tend to get us more depressed and cause anxiety and things like that. So how do we look within ourselves and try to hijack our emotions initially to get a positive response in there before we start feeling that negative emotion? So again, as part of the identifying emotions, thinking positive thoughts, choosing happy and trying to return there, even when life gets us down, to try to smile about things. And I realize it's easier said than done. So force ourselves, sometimes even look in the mirror, to force ourselves to smile, to think happy in order for us to feel happy. And that truly works with trying to help kids understand their emotions and to work with them as well. So the M is for manage. And so with the manage, I'm going to throw another acronym at us. And this is kind of what I call the B set, to try to take the sting out of stress. Okay. And so we're going to work with that a little bit here, because I tend to find that when we take a look at this B-set thing, is that there's a lot of farmers, and I worked with one person one time. Of all the things I went through over a course of about an hour with this one person, they came back and I said, well, what was the most helpful? And he said, well, just the fact that you taught me how to breathe. I can sleep better, I can relax more, I don't get so stressed out about what things happening. Because if anybody's familiar with livestock, when they get under stress, what do? A lot of shallow breathing, okay, a lot of respiratory breaths on a per minute basis. Okay, so how do we take a look at making it very shallow, slow and drawn out? So if we can slow down ourselves, or breathing, and go breathe in as deep as we can, and then try to hold it there and try to go the next step deeper. And then we exhale out slowly. And as we exhale out, can we actually exhale out a little bit more? And the next time we take in a breath, we're actually going to go deeper. And then we're going to exhale even further. And in the course of 3 to 5 minutes, hopefully people can actually get themselves to slow down their breathing, as long as their mind doesn't start running away and racing and things like that about what the problems are. If they can really stay focused on their breathing, or stay focused on something a little bit happier, to try to get themselves to be able to relax and whether it be sleep or just to relax and enjoy something else. So the E, the first E, stands for exercise. So one of the things when we get into stress is that if we don't have much movement, we just realize that blood movement and oxygen to the brain and things like that are extremely important. So I just tend to say, if you can get 7 minutes of heart throbbing exercise on a per day basis, people are going to feel a lot better. It's going to pull higher levels of serotonin. So as we eat better, just the big thing here, I think, is, sometimes our diets aren't the best, and we take a look at just the junk carbs and the junk sugars and things like that. The S stands for sublime, or how do we trade our pain, visual thinking of happy times. So when you have things to worry about, my goal is, if you need to worry about things from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. in the morning, please do so. But the rest of the day, I want you to think of something else. Get yourself doing something else, get your mind on something else. Otherwise, this stress can just drive us into the ground. Expressing acceptance of the reality of different types of situations that tend to happen to us, because we tend to focus on the problems rather than the solutions. And how do we talk ourselves through the positive emotions that, I can do this. And so it's positive self-talk, and hopefully positive talk with other people as well. And you do these together. I think that B-SET acronym is actually a pretty good one to help us to manage our stress. So more success in the B3, which means the breathing, the exercise, and the eating, I think, are three of the most important ones out of the whole deal. So the E stands for extending themselves. Okay, so when we take a look at it, a lot of, especially farm males, tend to be pretty introverted and stay by themselves. A lot of times their reaction to things might be just a withdrawal, which is a very difficult and actually can actually make the stress even worse. Because of guilt, shame, social stigma, other things that just inhibit people extending themselves to other people. So I think one of the key things is that anytime we feel close to others, it increases the oxytocin in our blood, a very positive emotion. It's kind of like the cuddly emotion or whatever. It makes us feel closer. We tend to think better. We tend to react better, work with it. I just think if you take a look at a cow that doesn't let her milk down and you give her a shot of oxytocin, what happens? Okay, it relaxes her and she can just kind of express herself a little bit easier and things like that. So doing things for others is another one. Sometimes we get so focused on our own problems that we forget to do things for other people. We realize research shows quite dramatically that the more we do for other people, it reduces our focus just on our own self and our own problems, and it actually helps them out as well. And so it's definitely brings people together. I also tend to say, force yourself to find things to smile about and laugh about, because we realize it's a good medicine. And sometimes even if you're really under stress, just even look at yourself in the mirror and just smile, try to create a chuckle, because we know that's going to increase the serotonin levels in our brain in a very important way. So togetherness and laughter is definitely great medicine. When we also take a look at loneliness, as farmers tell us, like during this time of COVID especially, that they're starting to feel a lot more lonely. And I appreciate that. I've got farmers that just says, they would call me up sometimes. They just say, I just needed somebody to talk to. And you kind of mentioned, don't be afraid to give me a call or whatever. So that's what they're doing. So we realize that people that seriously experience loneliness, it's about the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day, which means their life expectancy, instead of being in that 77 or whatever it tends to be, might only be in that 57, which I think is a kind of common life expectancy around the world, and even in developed countries, of people that are lonely. So loneliness can seriously kill us, so keep that in mind. Okay, so serotonin is a neurotransmitter. It's a contributor to feelings of well-being. We call that the happiness hormone. A lot of farmers don't get enough sleep. Okay, and so lack of sleep causes overstimulation of the amygdala, the back part of the brain. Okay, makes us more emotional, and an understimulation of getting things into the left frontal cortex, which is where the rationality is. So sleep is an important part of the picture that we need to take a look at. And that's why breathing techniques and things like that to help us sleep a little better are important. Again, forcing ourselves to smile, even if I would ask you to put a pencil between your teeth and force that smile, it's going to increase your serotonin levels. With sports, it's just basically an exercise. The body burns protein to manufacture serotonin. So it's important to get it to the point of exhaustion, which is kind of ideal for the brain, 7 minutes a day. As social contact, we just talked about the reduced life expectancy, but it's a very important piece of it. And sometimes people don't realize with spirituality and some of the research that shows, whether it be prayer or spiritual practice, actually helps people be happier, increases our serotonin levels. And then diet. So there's a lot of diets out there that are taking a lot of things like eggs and dairy out of it, but they actually increase our serotonin levels. Okay, so just to kind of be wary there, build serotonin levels as a habit. I've got a picture of what my serotonin levels look like and what I do in my life to increase my serotonin levels. Okay, the important part is not what I do, but the important part is, what does your serotonin picture look like, and what do you do to get yourself outside with exercise, music, water, campfires, different types of things, just get ourselves sometimes even off the farm to increase our serotonin levels or be with our family. So when we take a look at serotonin deficiency, the only one I want to take a look at here is we realize that prolonged periods of stress decrease it, eating bad habits, things like that. Realize it's made out of proteins, but the one I want to draw attention to right here is the pesticides. Is that there's a lot of farmers that are exposed to a lot of pesticides that can actually create a serotonin deficiency. And so the take home from this one is we realize that whether it be our skin pores or inhalation exposure is pretty real. So as easy as our sweat leaves the body, chemicals that are on our hands or around our body parts can actually infiltrate into our blood system, into our whole body, to actually cause some issues with that. So sometimes I think that's not one that we spend enough time with. When we take a look at other types of serotonin levels, I'm not going to take the time to go through this. It actually is in the publication that is in that chat box of farm stress resiliency guide or resource guide that's in the chat box that you can pull that down. It's also on our website under some of our COVID resources as well. But the serotonin is a serious stress support, no doubt. Exercise reduces a lot of endorphins, so that's an important piece of that too. And that's why I say in that B-set tactic, the breathe, the eating, and the exercise are probably the three of the most important pieces of that puzzle. When we take a look at the R stands for resources, I'm not going to take the time to look at that, but again, find whatever resources we can to make the best decisions we have. Share your resources with others as well. When we take a look at farming community support, problem solving techniques, looking at the pros and cons, again, writing those things down on paper, taking action steps, but the bottom line is to be proactive in that problem solving, set goals, and you can make them smart, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-based. But the bottom line is we need to have a dream. We need to have a goal to help us make through, because life is chaos. It's difficulty. There's a reality we need to make through, and we need to have a goal and have a plan to work with it if we're going to get through in a good fashion. Because we realize that research shows that those people that are most industrious and conscientious of actually working towards their goal tend to be the most successful in life. So share the resources as well. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the last phase of this, is that things have gone so awry that we're starting to lose things. And we get in this stage of grief. And we realize that whether a cow dies or we lose a job, cash flow, finances don't work out, even sometimes the loss of the farm, that we get into the stage of grief. So we all experience grief to different extents, whether we're farming or not. It's normal, just like stress is normal, grief is normal, because we're going to lose things in life. Okay, and it can actually be healthy in learning how to react to the loss of something that's loved and cherished. And it's it's a skill, just like dealing with stress is a skill, okay, to understand grief and try to deal with it, not so much to overcome it, but it's a process we need to go through so that we can actually take our lives from where they're at with a stage of grief and actually help it return to some normal functioning over time. So we need to kind of open the door to grief. Let's not shut the door, but open the door to the grief process. Okay, so we have acute loss. We can have acute grief, something that just happens, wasn't expected. We got the barn fire. We've got somebody died in a car accident, something like that. Sometimes we have ambiguous loss that we don't even know what happened. We can't understand so many, whether it be economic, financial, market forces that have happened. We don't know the why of it either. So all that needs the process of grief to deal with that loss. But again, it can be good so we can return to the meaningful life. So even in loss, all is not lost. There's something to return to. So I've got this grief recipe that I tend to use in some bereavement ministry that I do, but it works on the farm as well. So we realize that everybody goes through grief their own little way. Everybody needs their own little recipe. Grief takes time. And so how do we as people let it work in due time? Because a lot of times you'll find, people say, well, aren't they over that yet? And my response is, well, I hope they never get over it, but I hope they, in a healthy way, can actually process through that, because a lot of times we want to rush this thing called grief and help people just get over it. Okay, but I don't think that's the process. So grief has loss, and how do you keep memories alive? If I would take a look at, just different people that have lost something, just can you put a prayer corner, a picture of the person, whatever it was that lost, and just kind of keep it near and dear to our hearts over time. And I think that's an important part of it. We realize that grief can cause anger, which is a secondary emotion. But we need to realize that if it gets to the point of volatility or anger, that we just need to be aware and in response that, this is what they're dealing with, and help them understand what they're feeling because of this or because of that. Grief is messy, and so that grief has to get out of our bodies. And so it can get out by talking to people, it can get out by tears, but it just takes time for it to get out of our bodies so we can get to a normal functioning over time. So just let the body and the mind cry. Sometimes it's extreme stress, so we need to make sure that people are practicing safety because they turn to different types of things and maybe not making such healthy choices at times. It can be lonely because most other people can't really feel what we're feeling. And so one of the things about grief, it stops one's world and the world moves on. I like to share examples of people that have lost a son or daughter, right away, or a car accident happens or something like that. And, right away, anybody and everybody is there. But who's going to be that person that's going to be there 3 months down the road, 6 months down the road, even a year down the road, and even to the point where you actually actively try to talk to the person about it. And so sometimes when people are under still kind of in that grieving process, I'll actually say, well, how are you doing with the loss of, and I'll mention that person by name. Okay, and so sometimes they're shocked about it, but if they want to talk about it, sometimes they're too shocked to even say anything about it. But I will try to bring it up a second time, about how the family's dealing with this. And so a lot of times it's that second time that I bring it up that people want to talk about it, because now they've had a few minutes to think about it. Well, this person actually does want to talk about it. And one person came back to me one time and said, I appreciate you doing this because I want to talk about it. Nobody else ever wants to talk about it. In fact, they won't even mention him or her by name. It's like they're afraid to talk about it. It's like she never existed. Okay, so I use that as an example, is that people do need to talk about it. There's ways they do feel lonely. And just, where's their avenue, because they don't think anybody else wants to talk about it, or the world forgets and continues to move on. So grief, when people need exercise, get them out again, that the oxytocin, the serotonin, just getting them out, getting the brain working, getting the blood flowing, I think is a pretty important piece, because sometimes people feel like they've got each leg stuck in a 5-gallon bucket of cement and they just can't put one foot in front of the other because they're dealing with so much grief. It needs hope, without a doubt, to look at, life will get better. Okay, it might not be the same, but hopefully it'll return to that meaningful life over that time, and just how to get them to smile, to get them outside in nature. And just some of those natural things that increase their serotonin levels can do a lot to working with a person that's in their stage of a lot of grief. So sometimes when we work down through with people, I've got a tip down there in the bottom that there's a plan. Okay, so sometimes when people maybe have lost a child, I think is one of the worst ones, they lost a spouse. If people subscribe to that, there's a plan for everybody's life. Some people subscribe to that, some people don't. Okay, so it'd be actually kind of disheartening for people that don't, that we just say, well, there's a better plan or whatever, but what can be better than me just losing a spouse or me losing a child? Free will circumstances that happen in people's lives. Or one time somebody actually mentioned to me that they were going through a wake line, and somebody says, well, at least, the person just lost a child. What can be worse than that? Or maybe they're in a better place. Okay, that sometimes that's not very comforting to people either, or could be worse. What could be worse than what just happened to this child? Okay, so with good grief, the goal again is not to get over it, but to really savor memories of what was lost in that process, and the best we can do to try to process through that grief to return to that meaningful life. And so as we're dealing with grief, I just always say that do not underestimate the power of a touch, a hug, a handshake, just a smile, a kind word, a listening ear, an honest compliment. The smallest act of caring, which have that potential to turn a life around, from one of my favorite authors, Leo Biscaglia. So good grief can build stamina to survive what we didn't think possible. We do that for good grief's sake. And so I think this is heavily related to farming and agriculture, and just all the things and the life cycles that we go through with farming is actually a pretty good place for us to understand what grief is. And I remember from my own farming career, boy, I've got an emotional attachment to cows. When one died, I just really took that. I took that hard. Okay, it was a grieving process that I needed to help myself through. Nothing else I could have done here, there, whatever, but just it's a grieving process to deal with it. So again, good grief is a process. It is not a hurdle to get over. So isolation in many rural communities is not a friend of this good grief process. Again, so whatever we can do to be that person that can be there 3, 6, 9 months down the road, sometimes even a year down the road, to help them work different throughs. Again, as we go through grief, there's so many entangled emotions. How do we try to help them just identify the emotions they're feeling? And sometimes I think one of the biggest things that they realize that they're not alone. Okay. Because they think that all these emotions are the only thing, that they're the only ones that are working with it. And I think that's one of the important things that we find in our farm couple getaway. All their surprises are, well, I didn't realize everybody else had the same problem or the same issue to deal with in their family or on their farm. So again, know that one is not alone in the grief that we feel. When we take a look at understanding loss, I'd just like to put this picture in people's minds. We've been working with this, I think, for a lot of years. So the magnitude and the abruptness of the loss undoubtedly determines the amount of shock, the amount of denial, the amount of anger, and other different types of things that might be associated with it. So on the left side, we have normal functioning. And with the shock, denial, sometimes we realize we're grieving somebody that it's not such a shock because they may have been on their deathbed for 3, 6 months. We've had a lot of time to kind of process through what life was going to be without them. But if something just happens acutely, just overnight, we weren't prepared for it, that shock and denial can actually be a pretty important and pretty serious part of this whole thing. But the feelings of anger, the avoidance, confusion, the blame, the guilt, depression, detachment, just the loss of energy, and just how we get immobilized, it's tough for us to make decisions. And how do we get ourselves to reaching out to others, trying to find meaning in what happened and the acceptance, put a new plan in place, exploring options. But the goal is to get us here to return to meaningful life. It might not be as good. It might be, fair way down here, a lot worse. Okay, but what is that new meaningful life? And that's our new reality that we just need to do our best to deal with. And how do we try to accept that that is our new reality, and we're going to make the most of it, even though when people lose spouses, or especially when they lose children, it's one of the most difficult things to actually try to overcome is the loss of a child. And we realize that it affects a lot of marriages, that a lot of marriages don't make it through the loss of a child. And so it takes a pretty strong couple to actually make it through some pretty difficult times like that. So the tip with this one is that trying to rush through this curve or flattening this curve is not a part of the good grief process, because again, it takes time and we need to process it through. So with farm stress, we take a look at, there's a lot of emotions. The stress is normal. It's a part of reality. The difficult times in life are part of the reality as well. And just how do we do that? So we can do that by being more proactive, trying to create that resiliency, think positive, positive emotions, precursor to positive thoughts are precursor to positive emotions. And so that thought process, can we try to hijack our emotions? Can we try to use mindset tactics and a few other things to try to help us overcome that? But I think there's a lot of not just research, and I realize I didn't deal much with like personalities, but people's temperament, their personality really plays into this as well. And there's ways that we can actually kind of hijack parts of our personality to think of things more positive light as well. And so again, the faces are different, but as it gets into grief process, it definitely is a more serious thing to deal with. But we just need to kind of gauge, are we just dealing with farm stress, farm distress? The market reality is what we're dealing with, or has it gotten into a grief stage? And that's why I tend to like actually ending up with the grief part of it, because a lot of people don't realize that a lot of the stress actually gets to that point for people. And if it does, again, just to think about the confusion, the ability for us to process from the amygdala, the back part of our brain, when we've got the emotions running high and we can't get the brain circuits to actually get into that prefrontal cortex, which is our rationality part, our decision-making part. And so it's just how do you get them from point A to point B. And I think one of the biggest things we can do is to talk about it, trying to help them remember 3 things, try to write it down, those goals, and to realize that when we start losing hope and losing sight of those goals is when it kind of takes a look that we really need to get people help. And if you remember that slide that had those 12 things on it, we're trying to decide if our physical or emotional type mindset or whatever, and we start getting into the point where we're feeling stress and getting into that 9 level or greater, that it's not just that they need help, we need to actually be the person to get them help. So I think I'll stop there. If anybody has any questions or comments, or I don't know, Fred, if anything came into the chat box while I was talking, or.
We've got a couple of questions.
Okay.
First, always we'll open up if folks want to unmute their mic and ask a question. They'll have first shot at that. Otherwise, I've got a couple of questions here. Where does denial come into the picture with producers? As someone who walks onto a farm and you see obvious problems, but no, everything's okay is the answer.
Yeah, it's a big part of people admitting. It's kind of like when you're dealing with people that are addicted to certain things, whether it be alcohol or whatever. Okay, so to get them over the point of denial, when they take a look at especially I being working with a lot of people's finances, a lot of people are in financial denial, whether that be cash flow denial or profitability denial, is that they really don't want to see the whole picture of how bad it might actually be, because they just want to live their life out on this farm. And I want them to have the ability to do that too. But in order to do that, we need to admit that, we've got a financial problem. And I think when we take a look, especially on the financial side, Fred, is that there's a spiral to profitability. When people take a look at, are they have a net positive net farm income, or they're making a profit, good return on assets and things like that. That's kind of a spiral to profitability. But we've also got a spiral to bankruptcy that actually happens on the downside, and it actually happens a little bit faster. And so when people start realizing how fast they can actually lose um, a positive cash flow because of milk prices or whatever, and we let that go on, say for a year or so before we deal with it, it can actually be a pretty stressful situation that we might not be able to overcome. But we've got producers sometimes that might let that situation rest, and sometimes bankers as well that might allow it to rest, for 3 to 5 years, where it gets to the point of no return. Is that it's not just that I don't have many decisions left to be made as a farmer, because I left this spiral to bankruptcy go for so long, because I was in denial that it was actually a true problem to deal with. And so the longer this goes on, the more negative it goes on over time, the less the ability to make decisions the producer might have. And it's going to be more somebody else that's going to make that decision for them because of financial type things. But we also have that on a mental health stage as well, as that we deny that we might be somebody that's got high negative emotions. We might deny ourselves that, well, I'm trying to stay positive as much as I can, or I think I'm a very positive person. But a spouse or a kid might say, oh no, you're one of the most negative people I know. And so it's kind of that picture of ourselves, and we kind of deny that within ourselves. So I think that whole word denial is something that people need to work with. Denial of things that aren't so good in our lives. And I think people make that as a New Year's resolution, that I'm going to deny myself eating like this or that. Okay, but it's also a thing that when we start taking a look at things that we need to really go after, we kind of deny ourselves that is his problem to begin with.
Okay. I don't see anything being typed in the chat. Again, if somebody wants to unmute and ask, give that a second. Not seeing any. Uh, Over the last couple of years, if you've attended any of our programs, we've asked the question, have you seen stress in the families you work with? And about 90% of the responses are absolutely. And then we started asking, has it been to the point where it's prompted you to do something or have an intervention? Uh, how do we go about it when we see that there's a problem and it's obvious? Uh, what should I do?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I think it's a great one. So the acronym that I have in my mind is QPR. Okay, it's actually a program, that's a vetted program that actually talks about question, persuade, and refer. Okay, so it's more in a suicide prevention type phrase, but it's one that I keep in my mind just on my own, is that when I see that thing, is just do not be afraid to question. So some people even tend to find, if you say the word that you're depressed, or are you thinking about suicide or whatever, they think if you say those words, it's going to cause them to think, well, maybe I should do that. Okay, but research will tell us that's not true. So do not be afraid to question. In the same way with my buddy who was going through some grief, I try not to be afraid to question and mention that person by name. So don't be afraid to mention the problem, that this is what I'm seeing. Maybe the herd's not being taken care of quite so well. Is there something else going on? Are you feeling anxiety, depression, or whatever? So again, do not be afraid to question, and please take it the next step and actually pose the question. And again, I'll actually say take it even a further step, is if that they deny it, the word you asked about, if they deny it, do not be afraid to come back a second time. And so I actually had a person that I was working with that works with farmers. He says, I tried that technique, and when they mentioned it the first time, you're right, they didn't say anything. Okay, but I brought it back a second time. It cost me an hour and a half that they had wanted to talk about this issue. Okay, very proactive about actually trying to do that. So again, that whole questioning is important for us to do. So the persuade is that, when you start taking a look at, people that need help, and you can persuade them to try to talk to somebody, try to find resources, or whether it be family members or whatever, that they can talk about it, and realize that a lot of people are introverts, that they don't want to talk about it to anybody. But if they're opening up to you, just try to persuade them. So I've got one person I'm working with now that every time I leave the phone, I say, you just make sure you're safe and you take care of yourself, and that there's light at the end of this tunnel, as a person might be losing their farm and actually somewhat suicidal. Okay, so I'll just make sure that those are my last some gifts of hope or thoughts of hope, and try to express that. And then the refer, as you take a look at, we as dairy specialists, or we might be working with farmers in different capacities as veterinarians, as bankers, or whatever. I might be a fellow farmer myself. Okay, so how do you refer? Because we're kind of limited. So I'm not a licensed counselor, and I realize that. So there's different points in time where I need to refer somebody. It might be to another family member, but a lot of times it might be to a mental health professional that's actually a licensed counselor that can take them to the next stage. So QPR is probably the question: prefer or persuade and refer, probably the way I would answer that question.
Lots of great information, Larry. Thank you very much for taking the time and presenting to us. I put a slide up. If you'd like to go back and hear parts of this again, it's been recorded and will be archived at the Iowa State University Extension Dairy Team website. You have the link there. Would also encourage you to take the survey. If you scroll to the top of the chat box, you can click on that live link. Otherwise, the information, the link is there on the screen. For those of you who may not know, all of the folks who are part of the dairy extension team at Iowa State, this last slide put some photographs with the names. So hopefully, if you've got a question, you certainly can come back to us. Again, thank you all for attending. We appreciate Larry, you taking your time, and we'll see everybody next month on the 20th when we've got Dr. Dennis Toddy going to talk about the climate change and weather.